Grief. I've heard it described as a constant gnawing that feels like you have rocks churning in the pit of your stomach. Absolute exhaustion from night after sleepless night. Unpredictable and sometimes uncontrollable crying, feeling so badly that you question whether you will ever feel better. If you felt this way before, you're not alone. That's because it doesn't matter where you live or work, how much money you have, or how you vote. Man or woman, adult or child, when you lose someone important, you grieve. Hello, I'm Frank Sesno in Washington for the Hospice Foundation of America. Welcome. In a little while, I'll be joined by HFA's Ken Doka in New York, a recognized expert on issues of grief and loss, and by our special guest, Maria Shriver in Los Angeles, who will share some of what she's learned from her many experiences with loss, including her mother, Eunice Kennedy Shriver, her uncle, Senator Edward Kennedy, and her cousin, John F. Kennedy Jr. But we begin with a question. Why are you watching this program? Has someone important to you died and you want to know if what you feel is normal? Or perhaps you want to learn how to help someone else who is grieving. Maybe you've never had a loss and don't know what to expect. Whatever the reason you've decided to watch, we're very glad that you did.
Although we all grieve at one time or another, our individual grief experiences often differ. For one thing, there are many kinds of losses, and the feelings each evokes can be very different. Not only is someone's reaction to loss a very unique and very individual experience, so too is how they manage their grief. There's no magic wand to wave to make pain go away, but we can offer knowledge to help understand how grief affects the ways people think or behave, why grief makes people feel as they do, and suggestions to help manage the emotional, spiritual, and physical reactions that often accompany grief.
Now, wouldn't it be nice to avoid grief altogether and all of its unpleasantness? Benjamin Franklin wrote, "The only things certain in life are death and taxes." But he should have included grief. The fact is, grief is unavoidable too, unless, of course, you never form emotional attachments to anyone or anything. So what actually is grief?
I think that grief is one of those words that people don't really understand, look to find some easy way through it or some easy way out of it. There isn't one, because whatever you don't deal with today will come back and, as they say, bite you a couple years down the road. And I think that grief is a part of everybody's life. From what I've experienced, there's nobody who's spared an introduction to grief or a relationship with grief. And the other important thing is that I find is that to know that the pain of it other people have experienced, there's nothing wrong with you if you feel overwhelmed or overcome by it. I find that to be very common and, so to speak, normal. And the other thing that people have said to me is to just be kind and take to yourself and take your time with yourself.
That's absolutely right. Grief is a normal reaction to losing someone or something important to us. That loss can be a person, a pet, a job, a marriage, or some other relationship. Right after 9/11, many of us lost our sense of safety and security. That's a common reaction to any traumatic loss. But for this program, let's talk about the death of a person. After we lose someone important to us, our grief can trigger a variety of responses. Suddenly our world's turned upside down. We don't want to eat, or we only want to eat. We can't get to sleep, or we can't get up. We have trouble staying asleep. We have trouble staying awake. Often people experience intense emotions like sadness, loneliness, guilt, despair, even anger. It's not surprising then that when we grieve, it may be difficult to think clearly or to remember things. We may behave differently too, finding ourselves easily angered or always ready to cry. And grief can cause even the most devout to question their faith.
Suffice it to say that grief can make us feel awful, even sick. But it's important to remember this. All or any of these grief reactions, alone or in any combination, are not unusual. No matter how bad you feel, you're not the only one who's felt that way after someone important to you has died. If, however, you feel out of control, completely overwhelmed, or hopeless, you should seek professional help from your doctor, clergy, or hospice. Knowing what to expect and that you're not alone may be of some comfort, although it probably doesn't make it that much easier. If you find that your grief reaction is somewhat limited, even after the initial shock subsides, don't worry that you're cold or unfeeling. Often people whose grief is muted don't respond strongly or emotionally to other crises either. On the other hand, having a rough time of it doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. How you grieve is not a measure of how you love. Our founding fathers wrote, "All men are created equal," but that doesn't mean all losses are the same.
I think the one thing I've learned about dealing with grief is that every experience with grief is different from your previous experience. So you can experience grief as a daughter, as a spouse, as a niece, as a cousin. It all depends on your relationship with the person. People talk a lot about the new normal when it comes to grief. For some, if they had a very close relationship with a parent and that parent dies, that's a monumental grieving process. For others who might not have had the same kind of relationship with the parent, it's a completely different experience.
For many people, the death of a grandparent may be one of their earliest experience of grief. Everything else aside, it is natural and generally expected that the older someone becomes, the more likely they are to die. But that doesn't mean that their passing has less impact on loved ones. In many ways, the fact they have been there for so long seems to feel like they will always be there. The death of a parent is also keeping in the cycle of life, at least to grown children, though their grief is often compounded by the loss of their protector, advisor, and confidant. Family rituals may now be different. We'll speak more on that soon. And there may be other changes, such as selling the family home, or changed relationships with siblings or other relatives now that the parent is no longer present. Another loss we may experience is that of a spouse or a life partner. Such losses can be profound, and the grief reaction can be further complicated by how long the couple had been together, or how happy or unhappy they were in their relationship, and how dependent the person was on their partner. If they have children, particularly younger ones, there may be additional issues, such as the financial security of the surviving spouse or partner, and when, or even if, it is okay to pursue another relationship.
Grieving a sibling, particularly if all the children are relatively young, can present still different issues. For example, if the oldest child has died, the next oldest sibling may be expected to assume the role and responsibilities of the deceased child and fulfill new expectations to fill the void in the family. That's in addition to the other emotions associated with grief. And a word about the death of a son or a daughter. For one thing, the very notion goes against the order of life. Children of any age are not supposed to die before their parents. Events such as a stillbirth or a miscarriage can also trigger a grief response. And unfortunately, if your relation to the person who has died is viewed as unconventional or somehow unaccepted, your grief is real, but others' intolerance won't make things any easier.
Another factor that may complicate grief is your connection with the person who died. If you argued a lot, or argued recently, or had other unfinished business, like not having a chance to tell the person how you felt about them, or just to say goodbye, all can influence how you feel as you grieve. And if the person who died was not someone you admired or respected, is it even possible to grieve someone whom you are hard-pressed to recall anything good to say or think about, such as an abusive parent or spouse? The answer is yes. Although you may actually be glad the person is out of your life, you may still grieve the loss of hope that the relationship could ever be repaired. And long-term caregivers, to persons with slowly debilitating illnesses like Alzheimer's, for example, sometimes grieve throughout the illness, beginning when the patient is still alive but no longer the person we knew. And then, after the long-time patient dies, the caregiver may grieve not only the loss of the patient, but the loss of their long-time role as caregiver.
Another factor to consider is the circumstance under which the person has died. Was it a surprise, or was it expected?
I recently lost a dear friend who had a long battle with cancer, and he decided to forego treatment. And we called in hospice, and we interviewed different hospice care organizations, and he decided to go home. He wanted to die at home, and he wanted to die under the care of hospice. And it turned out to be a beautiful experience for his family and for those of us who loved him. And he really had a very clear idea. He had talked to his family ahead of time, and that to me was a whole new experience, to be with somebody who was young, who made a decision to use hospice care, who was very adamant that they did not want to die in a hospital, but wanted to die at home around people who loved him and people who would take care of him.
Besides managing the patient's pain, hospice keeps loved ones informed about the patient's condition and addresses questions and fears about what's happening and what to expect. In such instances, there's time to prepare. But there's no such opportunity for preparation and acceptance when the death is completely unexpected. In such a circumstance, the shock of the event may prolong disbelief of the loss and increase the intensity of the grief once the loss is accepted. In other words, you can't believe that he or she is gone. You just saw or spoke to that person. Everything was normal. There must be some mistake. But once the reality sets in, the grief reaction will too, and it could be intense.
If the loss is the result of suicide, murder, or a preventable accident, anger and other emotions may further complicate the grief reaction. People whose loved one was murdered often experience explosive feelings like rage and fury. They may even think about how to avenge their loved one's death. On the other hand, when a person takes his or her own life, the grief reactions often include guilt, helplessness, and remorse. Loved ones often think, "I should have seen this coming. This is my fault," or "I wish there was something I could have done." It is important to note that people who take their own lives often see no other way out of their despair. Usually their intention is to seek relief, not to inflict pain on their loved ones. Still, loss from murder or suicide creates some of the most challenging grief reactions.
There has been conflict throughout history, and while national holidays formally acknowledge our troops' sacrifice, their loved ones still must face life without them much sooner than they had expected. And what if you're not really sure the person is dead, as when someone has gone missing? Or when a person is alive but lost to us all the same, as in cases of advanced dementia? Or when someone's on life support and considered permanently unresponsive or in a coma from which they're unlikely to emerge. Such circumstances are called ambiguous loss, but they still evoke grief reactions. Understanding that how you grieve can be influenced by many factors is only half the story. The question then becomes, how and when will I feel better?
I have a great friend who just lost her husband after a long illness, and she told me that the first thing she wanted to do was go back to work. It was a place she felt that she could get back in control, where she felt useful, and that she felt was important to take her mind off of what had been a long illness. That was her way of grieving. Her children were doing the exact opposite. They had left their work, they had wanted to move home to care for their dad, and now just wanted to be there and try to figure out what their next steps would be. So even within a family, grieving takes many different forms. I noticed it with my own siblings. I have 4 brothers, and we've all grieved in different ways over the loss of our mother and our cousins and our uncle, depending on the kind of relationship we had, how well prepared we were or not. And I think that that's a daily challenge.
You've probably figured out by now that grief can be rather complicated, but grief can be managed. So as our first step in learning about managing grief, let's review a few basics. Although pretty much everyone has grieved or will grieve a death at some point, the experience is uniquely individual, even when 2 people grieve the loss of the same person. And since people experience grief differently, they also progress through their grief differently. There is no set timetable, No right or wrong, no too fast or too slow.
I think it never really helps to say to somebody, get over it, move on, it's been a month, it's been a year, because who are we to walk in that person's footsteps? I'm not an expert on grief. I don't pretend to be an expert on grief. I am someone who has experienced grief, and I would just say that the most important thing is to not be judgmental of someone as they go through their grief.
Okay, so you're probably saying, let's get started. I want to feel better. I don't blame you. But there are no quick fixes here. It takes time and work, and it won't be easy, especially at first. But we have some suggestions that should help.
Perhaps most important is to think about grieving as a process. That means it doesn't happen all at once. There are no stages which you advance in order by completing the step before. In each case, we need to find our own personal pathway as we journey through grief. No one can reliably predict how, when, or even if someone will progress through their grief to a specific desired outcome, such as completely accepting their loss. The reality is we live with our grief. It is entirely natural that even years later there may be occasions, such as a wedding, where we experience a surge of grief, when we realize that someone we love is not there to share that moment. Simply put, there'll be good days and bad days. There'll be ups and downs. The point is, you'll work through your grief at your own pace. And your pace may be different from others, and your pace may be different from one circumstance or death to the next.
The next suggestion is more easily said than done. Take care of yourself. We've heard it a million times. Eat properly, get plenty of rest, exercise. It's still good advice, although the idea here is to prevent a physical decline and achieve some sense of normalcy and routine, not train for a marathon. Many people find a walk to be refreshing for both body and mind. Others prefer more demanding physical activities. Whatever you choose, don't overdo it and don't beat yourself up if you're finding it difficult to get motivated. The same goes for eating. If you find comfort in a routine, don't worry that you have little interest in trying a new dish or a different restaurant. And it's okay to give yourself a break and enjoy some comfort food if you like, in moderation, of course. Maria Shriver has a suggestion to not overdo it in another sense.
Take your time and allow yourself the time that you need. And don't be worried about, oh, I should hurry up and finish this whole grief process because it's been a week, it's been a month, I should be back at work, I should be out socializing, I should be. There is no should be when it comes to grief. I think that's a really important message.
I agree. Things that were easy to handle before your loss may be too difficult now, at least for the time being. Although no one likes to disappoint, people have a remarkable tolerance for last-minute changes, even cancellations by someone who is grieving. But if you decide not to change your plans, at least consider an escape route. If you're relying on somebody else to get you to and from your commitment, consider arranging with them in advance the option to leave sooner than planned, should you feel the need to do so. Daily routines may offer comfort, but may also pose a challenge. Some people make sure their loved one's seat at the table remains vacant, or their clothes or other possessions remain in the drawers or closets where they've always been. Others prefer not to be reminded of their loss, so they change or eliminate such routines. Either way is okay. It's whatever works for you. You may feel better being around others, or you may prefer some time to yourself. Your feelings about being around others may change from one day to the next, and that's okay. Also, holiday traditions and festivities we typically associate with joy, but they can be difficult times for someone who is grieving, particularly if it's the first time their loved one will be absent. It's perfectly okay to leave early or to opt out of activities or gatherings altogether if you choose.
You may find people with the best of intentions offering advice, telling you, for example, to stay busy, to keep your mind occupied and your attention off your grief. That may be a good coping strategy for a while, so long as you want to be busy and it doesn't become a source of stress rather than relief. Sometimes people question their faith, while others turn to their faith for comfort and support. People who don't see themselves as religious sometimes find comfort in spiritual guidance following a death. But please, don't look for comfort and relief by abusing alcohol or drugs, even temporarily. Not only does that not work, it will make things worse. Most communities have resources available to assist when you feel overwhelmed. Most hospice organizations offer grief support groups, often at no charge, where you can find comfort and reassurance by sharing your feelings and hearing that you're not alone in your experience and pain. Other community-based social service agencies may also offer groups or helpful activities.
Accepting life without your loved one does not mean cutting ties or weakening bonds to the person who has died. Indeed, a big step toward living with loss occurs with rituals of remembrance. They don't have to be elaborate. For example, you can remember your loved one in prayer, by placing flowers at the grave, by toasting them during family or other appropriate occasions, or simply taking a moment each day to celebrate their life. The pain of grieving generally lessens over time, so you'll be better able to enjoy your memories. Some people use their grief as an inspiration to help others and volunteer their time and skills or establish a cause. That's how Mothers Against Drunk Driving came into being, as well as many charitable foundations.
We would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge that sometimes grief becomes more than someone can handle, and professional assistance may be needed. For example, it's okay to want some time to yourself, but not to want to be alone for days at a time. It's okay if you don't feel like getting out of bed in the morning, but there's a problem if you can't get up and out. It's okay to skip showering or shaving once in a while, but if you completely ignore your personal hygiene for days or let your living conditions become unsanitary, there's a problem. It's reasonable to expect to feel sad at times during the day, but you shouldn't feel only sadness all day, every day. Your grief may cause a change in your eating or sleeping pattern, but constantly sleeping too much or too little, or significant weight loss or gain may also be warning signs. And as we said in the beginning of this program, if you feel out of control or so overwhelmed by grief that you can't function, you should seek professional help. You could contact a local hospice, a grief counseling program, a pastoral counseling center, or a community-based mental health center. You could also ask a trusted friend or relative for the name of a social worker, grief counselor, psychologist, or medical doctor they can recommend.
Although the death of someone important to us may remind us of our own mortality, in rare and extreme cases, grief might cause someone to become preoccupied with their own death. They may consider or even attempt suicide. If this is how you feel, or if you suspect or know someone contemplating suicide, please tell someone immediately. You can call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-TALK at any time, literally. Someone's there to help 24 hours a day.
So let's review what we've learned today. Grief is a natural reaction to loss. How you grieve is unique to you and can be influenced by many factors. Although your reaction to grief is highly individual, you're not alone in experiencing what you are feeling. There's no single correct way to grieve. There's no timetable for grieving. You cannot eliminate grief, but you can manage it. You may feel awful now, but you'll feel better eventually. If you're overwhelmed, there are places to turn for assistance.
You might be scared to reach out, but I think it's very important to reach out to find other people who have been down that road, who might be going down that road, and can offer you comfort and can offer you a listening ear at a time that you'll need it. You can go to thehospicefoundation.org. They can direct you to support groups, to literature, to videos, and to hospice organizations around the country.
I remember when my mother passed away after a long and very personal battle with ovarian cancer. She died in the hospice, and we had all the support of hospice around us, explaining what we were going through, comforting, providing music therapy, pet therapy, but most importantly, connecting with the family members there, helping us understand what was happening and what would happen later, how we would feel, what my mother was feeling, and how she was comfortable and being treated with dignity. That made a huge difference, and it didn't eliminate our grief later on, but it put things in very important perspective. I think back on those days now, sadly and painfully at times, but with a great deal of comfort, because that support made all the difference. On behalf of Ken Doka and our special guest, Maria Shriver, I'm Frank Sesno, and I thank you for watching.